Russia is running out of Russians. That might sound a little bit dramatic, but it's actually true from a technical perspective. Russia's population is falling dramatically. So dramatically, in fact, that Russia has essentially already ceased to be a relevant global power, because their demographic crisis has now reached the point of no return. The problem is actually worse than you think, though, because even if Russia as a country can remedy this problem by convincing people from other countries to migrate to Russia en masse, which seems incredibly unlikely given the war and the horrendous living standards within most of Russia, even if Russia can do that, Russian as an ethnicity is declining in a way that cannot be remedied by outside forces. Nobody ever really seems to think about this, much less talk about it. But not only is Russia's population collapsing, but also the Russian ethnicity as a percentage of the Russian population is collapsing as well, at a very rapid rate. And while to us as outsiders this might not seem like that big of a deal, within Russia itself this is seen as a very, very big deal. There is a reason that Russia has always been called Russia, and within Russia there has always been a prevailing sense that a real Russian is an ethnic Russian, not just a person who happens to live within the borders of a country called Russia. And this prevailing sense has been used by Russia to justify their foreign wars. For example, invading Ukraine under the pretense of protecting ethnic Russians, using ethnic minorities as the bulk of the force that they used to conduct that invasion. But this period of history is coming to an end. Russia will be something very different within just a few decades. And this will be true regardless of whether or not Russia wins their war against Ukraine, because the outcome is now inevitable. We have a lot to discuss in today's video, so let's get into it. Now, the background of Russia that we'll explore today will of course be fascinating, but what's arguably even more fascinating is to understand something more about your own background and your own history and where you came from. For example, my father was adopted into the family, and so there are certain things about my own genetic history that we have simply never known and that I've always been curious about. And to finally get answers for myself and where you can go to get answers for yourself too, I've partnered with MyHeritage, the sponsor of today's video. MyHeritage is currently running a special promotion for viewers of this video, where you can get a DNA kit for just $29, a really low price that is much lower than from any other competitor. And with this, you can also get a 30-day free trial of MyHeritage, which you can take advantage of by scanning the QR code on screen and using the code Warburg. I've been super excited for the past couple of weeks because MyHeritage sent me my own DNA kit in the mail, and I've been super stoked to see what the results of that might be. I expect to see mostly German and Irish ancestry, but I've always been curious about how much Jewish ancestry I actually have, given that my father was adopted into a rather famous German-Jewish banking family that accumulated a multi-billion-dollar fortune that they had the audacity to not pass down to me. All I had to do was wait for the DNA kit that MyHeritage sent me. I opened it up and it had everything I needed to quickly collect a DNA sample just by swabbing my cheeks. Then all I had to do was wait for the results, which have now arrived. It looks like I am 36% Germanic. I honestly thought that was over half. I am 18% French. Wow, I didn't know that at all. I am 12.7% English. Everything is a surprise at this point. It keeps going. I am 10.5% Dutch, and I am only 1.6% Irish. I have been living a lie. I also see that there are over 10,000 people within MyHeritage who are a genetic match for my DNA. So these are people who are my family that I've never connected with, which is super awesome. With that in mind, what's great about this is MyHeritage has committed in their privacy policy to never license or sell genetic data, so I don't have to worry about my information getting misused without my consent. If you want to explore your own heritage, as I said, MyHeritage right now is running a special promotion for viewers of this video, where you can get a DNA kit and do your own ethnicity estimate like I just did for just $29 or 29 euros. Plus you also get 30 days of free access to the rest of the MyHeritage platform. Just scan the QR code on screen and use the code Warburg. Now, back to the analysis. When it comes to the topic of the demographic collapse of Russia, there are two major branches of this analysis, the first of which is well known, but which has become significantly worse since the last time I discussed it, and the second of which is not so well known and is rarely discussed at all. The first branch, of course, is the mere fact of Russia's population decline in and of itself, which I will look at in depth in this video to show the reasons why Russia's population is collapsing and why there is almost nothing Russia can do to remedy that. But the second branch of this discussion is the collapse within the collapse. The collapse of the Russian ethnicity within Russia itself, which is a much bigger deal than a lot of people realize, because more than the population collapse itself, this collapse within the collapse affects the Russian psyche, and in particular, the psyche of the Russian leadership that is making decisions like the decision to invade its neighbor, Ukraine. So in this video, I'll be addressing both of those branches in order, starting with the population collapse in general. And as I start this discussion, it is very important to tell you my major sources for this information, because I'm constantly told in my videos that what I'm talking about is merely Western propaganda and that the problems I discuss aren't real problems at all. But as it turns out, the truth couldn't be further from that. The reality is that the topics I'm discussing today are topics that have been discussed within Russia itself for a very long time, in fact, for decades. And the biggest champion defending all of the major points that I'm going to talk about in this video is Vladimir Putin himself, who for a very long time has cited Russia's demographic problems as the most important problems within all of Russia, a narrative that he only changed after he decided to invade Ukraine. Now that Russia has invaded Ukraine, making its demographic problem even worse than it already was, Russians often tell me that any discussions of Russia's demographic problems are mere propaganda. But that is because the demographic collapse narrative does not support the narrative that the Russian government now wants to tell, which is the narrative of its endless war against the West, against NATO, and its need and desire and ability to have victory in Ukraine. In fact, a lot of analysts have noted that the reason Vladimir Putin decided to invade Ukraine was largely because of his failure to adequately address the problems that I'm going to discuss in this video, where Vladimir Putin could not solve the problem that he said for decades was Russia's biggest problem. So he had to create another problem for him to tackle to continue with legitimacy as Russia's ruler. There are also other elements to this where Vladimir Putin, seeing the decline of the Russian population, which he was not able to reverse, who also wanted to start a war, realized that every passing year that he waited, Russia's population was getting less and less and less on its own. And in his twisted logic as a dictator who is seeking historical glory for himself, he decided that he needed to use the Russian population while he had them to begin carrying out conquests immediately, hoping against hope that he would actually succeed in these conquests and be able to use the populations of the countries he captured to help kind of sideline the issues that were being caused by the demographic crisis at home. This pre-framing before getting into the actual details of the population collapse turns out to actually be very important, because it reveals the significance behind the population collapse itself within a country like Russia, which views itself largely in imperial terms. For a country like Russia, population collapse is a terrible thing, but it's not a terrible thing in and of itself. It's a terrible thing because of what it means. For a country like Russia with imperial ambitions, when the population decreases, it's not like the rulers care that their population is less in and of itself, other than the fact that larger country makes me feel bigger because bigger numbers always better, right? But it actually is a problem for Russian leaders because population is indicative of the source of all of their power. A larger population means a larger ability to succeed in wars of conquest against other countries. And in a country like Russia, which is an oligarchy, where all of the resources are controlled by the elite, a larger population also means a larger number of people to work to create wealth for you at lower wages. And so when we see the decline of the population of Russia, what we actually see in a very real sense is the decline of Russian power. That's not necessarily true and other countries, where small countries often take advantage of their small population to build different strategic advantages for themselves. For example, Sweden, which has become very powerful militarily in terms of technological advancement, largely because it knows it has to rely on its brains rather than its mere brawn in terms of raw population numbers. And that has allowed Sweden, in a large sense, in countries like Sweden, to really prosper extremely well. Russia, though, measures itself by its size, and its size is decreasing in all of the most important ways. Russia might point at the map in Ukraine and say, look, the country of Russia is bigger because we've captured more territory that is now completely desolate because we captured it through such horrific warfare. But in all the ways that really matter, which is the actual population of Russia, Russia is declining at a rate that is now no longer recoverable. So now let's get into the specifics of that so that you can see how bad the situation really is. First, there's the raw population itself, where in 1994, shortly after the Soviet Union collapsed and Russia became an independent country, Russia had a population of approximately 149 million people, which has now decreased today to a population of around 145 million. And at first, that might not seem like that big of a deal. Who cares? Just a decline of 4 million. But the reality is that the population collapse trends have now begun, and that reduction in population is going to get a lot faster. And we know that when we look at the demographic split or the demographic distribution of different ages throughout Russian society, where we see a huge number of Russians actually reaching retirement age, basically getting older and living longer than they did a couple decades ago, but very few new Russians actually being born. So Russia's population is shrinking, and it will start to shrink at a more rapid rate because life expectancies have basically now peaked, and there's not new people being born. So once all the people who were able to live longer start to reach the end of their lives, Russia's population will drastically decrease, and we're just talking about life and death mechanics. We're not talking about things like immigration and people leaving the country of Russia. This is, on its surface, a huge problem, because what it means is that there are every single year less young Russians available to work to fill the jobs within Russian society, and more older Russians who are unable to work or who don't have a desire to work or can't work as productively as they once did, who have reached retirement age and who are relying on an ever smaller subset of people to make up those wages for them to help to fund their pensions. There are a lot of different indicators that we can poke at to show how bad this problem really is, and to show how it's actually getting worse and worse every single year. One of them is the birth rate in Russia this year in 2025, where in the first 3 months, in the first quarter of 2025, there were less than 300,000 births in all of Russia, which is the lowest amount of births in over 225 years, which means Russia currently is just not having any babies, basically. Overall, last year in Russia, there were 600,000 more deaths than there were births, which might not be that surprising given the fact that Russia is at war with Ukraine, but it would still be more deaths than births even if Russia was not at war. When people look at these trends and a lot of other data points, a lot of people have estimated that by the end of the century, and probably well before the end of the century, Russia's population will have decreased to only about 120 million people, again as compared to 149 million people in Russia in 1994. And this population will be increasingly lopsided with each passing year, with far more older people who are net drawers from the economy, who've earned that. I'm not saying it's a bad thing, but far more older people who are net drawers from the economy than there are young people who are net contributors to the economy. And that puts Russia in really dire straits. It means that they won't really be able to do anything internationally because they will be so focused on just surviving and earning enough income at home to meet the very base necessities. Now, there are a lot of reasons for this population decline, and I've already mentioned one, the birth rate, but it actually goes far beyond that. Just looking at the birth rate again really quickly, though, the birth rate in Russia sits at somewhere around 1.3 or 1.4 births per woman, which is really, really low, because if you think about a woman having children, that woman needs to have 2 children just to replace herself and her partner, just from a purely mathematical perspective. And so Russia has a very low birth rate, and that's owing to a lot of different factors. The most commonly cited factor, though, is kind of a sense of societal despair, mixed with the fact that Russia is moving from a more agrarian economy to an economy with a lot of people within cities. When people used to farm, having children were considered an asset because that's free labor to work on your farm. When people move into cities, especially Russian cities, where real estate is far more expensive than most people can afford, and where good jobs are quite hard to come by for most Russians, not all, but for most Russians, those children become a net expense, and it's something that you actually have to plan and budget for. And when most Russians do the math for themselves, and they look at the state of their country and where their country is going, they think it's going to be worse tomorrow than it is today. And so I am struggling to either want to, or even to financially be able to afford to, bring more children into this world. And so that declining birth rate is a huge factor. But that declining birth rate isn't unique to Russia. That declining birth rate is present in a whole lot of countries. And even in the United States, we have a birth rate that's below replacement level. And yet Russia's demographic crisis is still far worse than most other countries. So why is that? And the reality is that there are a lot of other factors beyond the birth rate that lead to a demographic crisis, particularly a shrinking population that becomes lopsided towards older generations. And big reasons are immigration, or rather net immigration, net migration, whether there are more people coming into your country than there are leaving. In the United States, because it is a country that a whole lot of people want to move to, we have been saved from a lot of the worst aspects of our demographic problem because we have immigrants coming into our country to actually replace the workers that we're not giving birth to ourselves. And so while there's a lot of anti-immigration rhetoric in the United States, it's clear that we need immigrants to come into our country to actually continue supporting the economy that we've become accustomed to. That tangent aside, Russia does not have that. Russia, obviously, we saw at the beginning of the war in Ukraine, tons of people wanting to leave the country for obvious reasons. Nobody wants to fight in a war where you could potentially die. Nobody wants to live in a wartime economy if they don't have to. And so we saw figures of over 1 million young Russians very quickly leaving the country. And it's hard to know the exact figures, but it was massive. And at the same time, it is very rare for people to actually want to migrate to Russia for reasons we'll get into soon. Part of it has to do with that dominant Russian ethnicity we discussed earlier in this video, though, and that I'll move to in just a second. Not a lot of people want to move to Russia because there are tensions in Russia against migrants from most countries. There's not a lot of opportunity in Russia to begin with. And so most migrants, when they're selecting a country to move to, if at all possible, they're going to choose a different country. Russia has, to a large degree, self-sabotaged themselves in this way. They, of course, have a massive amount of land, and they should conceivably have people from other countries being able to move into their country and use some of this unoccupied land, even if it might be less than ideal circumstances. There is a lot of good land in Russia that still sits unused. But because Russia is so focused on their ethnic identity as Russians, for years there has been anti-migrant rhetoric from Russia in Russian political discourse against migrants coming in from Central Asia, from China, and from a whole suite of other countries. And that has directly worked against people coming in and actually solving their primary problem. And of course, the war in Ukraine, as I already said, isn't doing them any favors there either. But aside from migration, there are other problems leading to Russia's demographic crisis that make it far worse than in other countries. There are two ways that you can cause a population collapse. The first is to not have enough babies in the first place. The second is to have people dying far younger than they should. And that has definitely been the trend in Russia, even long before the war in Ukraine. Russians die young for a whole lot of different reasons. One that is commonly cited is alcohol addiction, which is the predominant drug throughout the country. About 40% of Russian men are known to binge drink on a weekly basis, and this is actually going back to a long history in Russia of state-sponsored alcoholism, where alcohol was actually produced by the Russian Empire. It was subsidized by the Russian Empire as one of the only actual manufactured goods within the country in mass, so that the people would intentionally become addicted to it, and that would leave them subdued to the state rather than having the ability to rise up against the state. The idea was that people would have to go to the state to get their fix, and so people wouldn't want to ruin that relationship because alcohol became one of the most important things in their lives. And even more than that, the alcohol itself would also help to distract them from how terrible their lives really were, kind of taking the edge off the existential dread that existed living within the Russian Empire, keeping them away from actually having the desire or the ability to rise up against the czars. Russian society has tried to change this a couple of different times. In the Soviet Union, alcohol was at first banned because people recognized it as a weapon the state used against the people. Stalin brought it back. In similar fashion, when the Soviet Union collapsed, there were attempts during a short window of time when Vladimir Putin was out of office to have laws in Russia to curb the rampant alcohol abuse. And as soon as Putin got back in office, he got rid of those laws and reinstituted the old fashion of alcoholism in Russia. He even has his own vodka brand, and we see that the existential nature of all this continues, and it has led to a drastically declined life expectancy in Russia, particularly among young men as compared to both the United States and Europe. I don't remember the figure off the top of my head. I've referenced it before. I think it's either a 7 or a 10-year decline. Alcohol abuse, though, is of course not the only vice within Russia. There are other problems that are not quite as big, but are still huge. A lot of people don't realize Russia has a massive addiction problem, and at one point, around 10 million Russians, or 1 in 15 people, were actually addicted to. And that went hand in hand with another epidemic in Russia that hardly anybody ever talks about, which is the HIV epidemic, where Russia, as compared to Europe, has a much higher rate of HIV than any other European country. I mean, it is literally magnitudes greater, and these are just a couple of health problems that we're mentioning within Russia that are causing their life expectancy to be so much lower than it is in other countries. What we see here then is a picture of existential dread that is dragging on Russian population numbers in every direction. It is lowering people's life expectancies so people don't live as long in the first place, and it's also making it so people either don't want to or don't have children in the first place. And this in a country that tries to present itself as a large Christian country with traditional family values. But obviously that is just something the country says. It has not actually trickled down into the sentiment of the population, who do so many things that work against their own survival and their own life expectancy, and therefore the survival and the life expectancy of the country. And as it turns out, as I said, these things are not accidental or they're not incidental in Russia. They are a direct consequence of the way the country is run, the way it is run as a dictatorship and as an oligarchy, where everything is designed to allow the elites to control the system, keeping opportunities away from the common man, and leading people to not have nearly as much value for life as they otherwise should. All of that means that Russia's population collapse as it currently exists is not on a trajectory or a trend to get any better. it's only going to get worse. And so we will see Russia's population collapse over time in a direction that is not recoverable. So that's the population collapse itself. Now let's talk about a topic that nobody seems to be talking about, but that actually has a massive impact, as I said, on the Russian psyche, which is the actual decline of ethnic Russians in pure numbers, but also as a percentage of Russia's population as a whole. When it comes to ethnic Russians, when we compare census data between 2010 and 2021, which notably is before the war in Ukraine, so things have actually only gotten even worse, we see a huge decrease, where ethnic Russians decreased from around 111 million to around 105.6 million, which when you look at the raw numbers is a larger number than Russia's population as a whole has collapsed since 1994. And what we see is Russia is becoming increasingly less Russian in just purely ethnic terms. And actually, during the same time period, the numbers are that ethnic Russians as a percent of population dropped from around 77.7% to somewhere around 71.9%. And that's a really drastic decrease in just 10 years. And again, as with the population decrease, the trends that are causing it aren't going away. They're actually getting worse. And so we will see the rate at which ethnic Russians decrease as a percentage of the population increase over the next couple years, which means in a couple of decades, there will be potentially less than half of the Russian population being composed of ethnic Russians. Now, this is a tricky topic of conversation we're entering into, because a lot of people will ask, and by the way, myself included, why does it matter what the ethnic makeup of a country is? Why is that even relevant? Isn't a person a person? And of course, I would agree with that, and I would promote that. But notably, Russia doesn't believe that. For Russia, having a predominantly ethnically Russian country is extremely important to them. That has always been true historically in the Russian Empire, and it still remains true today. And a lot of people are going to tell me this isn't true today, you're just making that up. And so to prove it to you, I would just say, look at how Russia engages in its wars and what it always uses as a pretext to start its wars, particularly look at Ukraine, where one of the main pretexts that Russia used was Ukraine is mistreating ethnic Russians. Therefore, we, as the Russian overlords, need to invade another sovereign country to protect the ethnic Russians. And this is an action that shows that the lens through which Russia views the world is not predominantly one of national boundaries or national borders, but rather the most important identity to them is the Russian ethnicity. Now, it turns out that this works both ways. In the same way that Russia will violate another sovereign country's borders because their ethnic Russians are being mistreated, so within their own country's borders, other people who are not ethnically Russian do not hold the same status, at least in the minds of most people. Legally, they might hold the same status. That does not mean that they are treated or valued the same. And we see this across the political spectrum in Russia. A lot of people don't realize that Alexei Navalny, the famous Russian opposition leader who is opposed to Vladimir Putin, a big way that he rose to prominence was actually with rhetoric that was poised against Central Asian immigrants into Russia. And he took advantage of frustrations around that issue to bring himself into power. And this is Alexei Navalny, who compared to Vladimir Putin was definitely the good guy. And maybe he changed his political stance later in life. I'm not super familiar with all of his politics, but that is a very interesting point to show you how important this issue is to Russia. Another reason you can see this so clearly is because when Russia engages in its wars, not only are they engaging in this warfare to protect quote-unquote Russian minorities, but they are also typically using ethnic minorities to do the actual invasion. And of course, they're still using, some Russians as well. But when you look at the proportions, it is always much more heavily weighed against much smaller ethnic minorities. And so what Russia does is it uses the ethnic minorities within Russia itself to protect ethnic Russians within other countries. And what you never see is the reverse. You never see, for example, Russia trying to create a pretext to invade Mongolia or other Central Asian countries. There are, of course, a lot of ethnic groups within Russian borders that have ethnic ties to Mongolia. And we don't see these groups creating a pretext to go and protect, the other people of their ethnicity. The pretext is always exclusively focused on the Russian ethnicity. And this is what makes you realize that Russia doesn't really care about quote-unquote injustices in the world. They don't care about if other people are being mistreated in other countries or anything like that. They only bother to create the pretext, and it is a pretext, a lie, that people are doing it to ethnic Russians and that people are oppressing the Russian language. So this establishes that Russia still sees itself today in largely ethnic terms, and it views Russia really as about the Russian ethnicity more than about the borders of the Russian state. But where does this come from? Well, it turns out this comes from a long-established history. A lot of you have probably heard of the Ruski Mir, which is basically the Russian world, and it is a concept that goes back to the days of the Russian Empire, where they saw Russia as an ethnicity, Russian language, and Russian culture as predominant and preeminent, and basically they had a right to rule over other countries. Russia was an empire, they went out and invaded a whole lot of little minor groups that they decided to become dominant over. And within the Russian Empire, there was always a division between the Russians and the other people within the Russian Empire. And this has persisted up to Vladimir Putin rather explicitly, where he symbolically got the Russian ethnicity, the ethnic Russians, identified as the state-forming people. And while it might have been symbolic, quote unquote, without any actual legal ramifications, it still shows that within Russian society today, there is a legal desire to acknowledge the Russian ethnicity in some way as the superior state-forming ethnicity, the most important one to uphold, the most important one to protect, the most important one culturally to protect too, by the way. When it comes to people saying Russian culture is being eroded, they're always talking, about the ethnically Russian culture. They're not talking about the many, many cultures that exist throughout lands that are now within Russian borders that have been degraded and run into the ground and who have lost most of their history. It's always about, no, we need to protect the ethnic Russian culture. For his part, Vladimir Putin has actually used terms in Russian political discourse like the need for ethnic survival, which in and of itself is very telling. So with all of this in mind, we're now poised to see the true significance of the collapse within the collapse. The decline of ethnic Russians as a percent of the Russian population within the collapse of the Russian population as a whole. And what we realize is that Vladimir Putin and people like him are quickly losing the things that are the most important to them. They are losing this Russian empire that they so desperately want to rebuild. And they are losing it in large part because of their own policies. I think there's a couple reasons that ethnic Russians are declining at a rate faster than other ethnic groups within Russia. One of them is because these people have always been treated better in a sense, ironically, and have been given better education, better opportunities, but they have still been forced to live within a state that doesn't value them as individual human beings. It might value them better because of their ethnic traits, but it doesn't value them as much as human beings. And so we see a lot of these people who are the most well-educated within Russian society being the first to leave when things happen like the war in Ukraine. We also see these people being the ones to have less children, whereas the other ethnic minority groups, ironically, because they have not been given as much support by the state, still a lot of times live more agrarian lifestyles where they value having more children rather than the children being seen as an expense to them. And so we see these and a lot of other reasons as why ethnic Russians are declining as a proportion of the Russian population. Within Russian political discourse, there are actual discussions that if too many ethnic Russians get replaced by other ethnic groups, that the ethnic Russians' ability to control Russia itself will degrade, and essentially Russia will cease to exist as a state. Again, you see the value in which they place themselves versus the other groups. And with all of this in mind, there is a cynical part of you that has to wonder if when Russia goes to war against countries like Ukraine and they disproportionately target ethnic groups for conscription or recruitment into the military, that part of that tactic is to lower their ability to have more births and to lower the ethnic populations within Russia and to proportionally support the ethnically Russian population even more, which is extremely sick calculus, but it is not something that anybody who has watched what Russia has done in Ukraine would actually be surprised about. Now, some of you might ask, where am I going with all of this? And the answer is I'm not really going anywhere. I'm just trying to share the facts about what is happening in Russia demographically and how they are coping with that. But I guess one place that we can go, one thing that we can see from all of these discussions, is that Russia is declining as a globally relevant force. It's declining because of the things that it has done to itself, because it valued things like ethnic dominance over actually caring for the people within their own borders and ensuring that everybody within their own country could actually be prosperous, because they focused so much on old world imperial ideology. Their empire will crumble. And while we don't know exactly what it will look like in 20, 30, 40, 50 years, it is certain to just be a shell of what it formerly was. And that is because Russia has made its bed, and in particular, Russian leadership has made its bed, and now it has to lie in it. Thank you so much for watching. This video was honestly really hard to make. These are really dark topics, and it was really hard to think through these topics and how to communicate them in a clear way, to show really the evils of what is going on in our world today and how desperately the world needs to work together to fix these problems. If you want to support this channel, there's a couple ways you could do so via the links in the description. Don't expect any paid support from anybody, but it's there if you like to support my work, and I really appreciate that. You can also like this video and subscribe to the channel. That's completely free. Before you go, don't forget that MyHeritage is running a special promotion for viewers of this video to get a DNA kit for just $29 or 29 euros. I definitely recommend you check that out, and you can do so by scanning the QR code on screen and using the code Warburg.